Salute, my Quickclassics friends. It's your friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton, coming to you on this Friday, January the 31st, 2020. Today we begin our series on the Aegean civilizations. That means the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. And I preface this discussion with an episode on Frank Calvert, who was the real archaeological hero of the founding of the finding of the city of Troy. But we turn the clock back to the third millennium BC today, and take a look at the older of the Greeks before the Greeks, as it were, the Minoans. Typically, we think of the Greeks as at least the image in the popular mind is that from the classical period, the philosophizing, toga-wearing, democratizing Greeks. But there was certainly a chain of civilization that existed before that, on which later Greek societies were actually founded. And the Minoans are the earliest of those. They were a late Bronze Age civilization on the southern end of the Aegean world. And by way of geography, the Aegean Sea, of course, is that body of water in the eastern Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey, and bounded on the south side by the island of Crete. And it's the island of Crete where we find the ancient Minoans. And the length of their civilization was essentially from about 2700 BC until about 1100 BC. And any discussion of Minoan civilization really has to begin with their dominance of the Aegean world, and they were certainly in control politically and economically of the Aegean world. At the height of Minoan civilization, cities on the mainland of Greece like Athens and Thebes were mere villages, essentially, that paid tribute to the Minoans. Most of what we know about the Minoans comes from archaeology, although we do have a few examples of their writing, but not enough to build a culture narrative. Most of that's coming from archaeological evidence. But eventually the Minoans did build city-states on the coastal regions, cities like Phaistos, Zagros, and most notably Knossos. Knossos was sort of the de facto capital of the Minoan world, and it's a hallmark, really a token of Minoan engineering and architecture. The palace at Knossos is really quite fascinating. There's some pretty amazing technological advances that it showcases. In many ways, the palace at Knossos was much the first smart home, essentially, at least for the times. But it had indoor plumbing, it had light wells that captured all the available light during the course of the day, and air conditioning, which would take advantage of the sea breezes and circulate them throughout the palace. So this was no mean hovel that the kings at Knossos were living in. The art left to us by the Minoans actually tells us a great deal about their day-to-day life. Certainly we have some depictions of royal life, but I think what's more interesting are the depictions of the everyday citizens. And we learn a lot about what their professions were. Of course, we're talking about a maritime culture, so there were depictions of fishing and the Navy, and we even have clear depictions of what they dressed in, what their hairstyles were like. Men typically went shirtless with a kind of a kilt, and they would shave their heads except for a few locks and tie those up in ponytails. They were sports fans. We have depictions of them boxing and running and taking part in some sort of Olympic-style games. Of course, this is several centuries before the actual first Olympics. But thankfully, we do have these depictions in art. One of the common themes in the art of the island is the bull, which is a most likely representative of Zeus. Of course, the bull, really since the late Pleistocene, and the big bovine creatures like the aurochs stayed in the mines, made such a potent impact on the cultural consciousness of uh, Near Eastern and Mediterranean societies, that this symbol became one of virility and power, and that seems to be the case in Minoan religion and symbology. We'll get back to that in just a second. While archaeology, as I say, tells the bulk of the story of the Minoans, we do have some examples of their writing. Um, the writing system that was used on the island of Crete was called, or is called by scholars, Linear A. That of the mainland, Linear B. Now, we know quite a bit more about Linear B than we do Linear A. What we know about Linear A in particular comes to us from the work of Michael Ventris, who was an architect, and ancient languages was his hobby. Sadly, Ventris died fairly young. I think he was in his early 40s in a car wreck, and along with most of his latest work, I think had been destroyed. At any rate, we owe Ventris quite a bit. Um, there's some interesting inscriptions, probably most notably the so-called Phaistos disc, and there's also an inscription that bears the name of probably the most famous name associated with the island of Crete and Minoan civilization, King Minos. Um, Now, the mythology of the Greeks, they believed, stemmed in large part from this island. And what a lot of people don't realize about Greek mythology is that the Greeks themselves often thought that their gods came from other geographical locations, particularly the east and the south. And so you have Turkey and the ancient Near East and Egypt being homelands for a lot of their gods. Zeus himself was said to have been born and raised in a cave on the mountain in the center of the island of Crete. So the Greeks looked to the ancient Minoans as the sort of the originators of many of their myths. The Minoans themselves were certainly a very religious people, as we can tell from the archaeology. The aforementioned bull symbolism, the mistress of the beast, was a kind of a snake goddess. Uh, there were some of the more, I suppose, primitive uh, deities that were worshipped. But we are definitely talking about a polytheistic people here, subscribing to an Olympian style religion. Other common symbols on the island were the double-bladed axe, the labrys, and of course there are lots of spiral and labyrinthine patterns because the labyrinth is also associated with Minoan culture, and especially the myth of the Minotaur, which brings us back to King Minos and the Minotaur and this inscription of King Minos, who probably was a historical figure. If this inscription is any evidence of that, the inscription reads, um, I can't remember the exact phraseology, but I know that King Minos' name is in it as Raja Mino. Now, if you recognize that word Raja, it sounds like Raj from Sanskrit, which means king, and Rex from Latin, which also means king, because we're dealing with the same sort of Indo-European roots for these languages that end up in the Aegean world, in Europe for that matter. But the story of King Minos, I will synopsize here. Most of you will be familiar with Minos and the Minotaur. Uh, Long story short, King Minos was to give a prize bull every year to the god Poseidon. And one year he didn't want to give his prize bull away, and so he gave us his second most prized bull. And in Greek myth, whenever humans try to pull something over on the gods, it always ends up terribly for them. And Poseidon, angered by this, uh, made the bull fall in, or made the queen fall in love with the bull. And the product of this union, without getting too gory and graphic, was the Minotaur. Unfortunately, the Minotaur, this half bull, half man creature, was very violent and had to be essentially imprisoned and placated. Minos called on Daedalus to build the labyrinth under his palace to house the thing, but it took 7 young men and 7 young women taken from the mainland every year to sate the appetite of the Minotaur and keep him at bay. This is also probably a reference to the dominance, political and economic and cultural dominance that the Minoans had over people living on the mainland of Greece at the time. But as the story goes, Theseus would emerge from Athens and put a stop to this. He found his way through the labyrinth to the Minotaur, kills the Minotaur with the help of the daughter of King Minos, and would eventually escape. This myth is very much associated with Minoan and certainly later Greek mythology. Uh, in fact, as I say, it's the name. Minos is the name from which Minoan civilization takes its name, and we have Sir Arthur Evans to thank for that, who did most of the groundbreaking archaeology on the Minoans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But about around 1550 BC, there was a volcanic explosion on the island of Thera, which is not too far away. That's Santorini today. And it blew out the entire center of the island. It was a larger explosion than the Krakatoa volcano in Indonesia. And this had a tremendous impact environmentally and politically for the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, the entire world. The ash cloud can be seen in the archaeological record as far away as California. And it would have had a kind of nuclear winter effect on the growing seasons for a couple of years. And as we know, these sorts of disasters produce tsunamis and all kinds of upheaval. People get displaced. A lot of coastal settlements were destroyed. You see a rise in piracy in the wake of this, and altogether a beginning of the demise of Minoan civilization. These pirates were collectively known as the Sea Peoples, and we'll get to that soon enough. But the demise of Minoan civilization leaves this power vacuum open in the Aegean. Enter the Mycenaeans, who lived on the mainland. And that will be the topic of our next discussion. As a footnote to this, the Bible talks about the island of Crete as the place where the Caphtorim, who, if we're to believe the Table of Nations, Caphtor was part of the line of Ham and related to Nimrod. Caphtor is mentioned in the same sentence as the Philistines. And so there is this connection with the biblical world and by proxy the world of the giants as well. So again, if you like the content, click a like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time when we talk about the Minoans.